Good afternoon and welcome to the Redbird Educator Series. I'm Christy Angleton. I'm an assistant professor of early childhood literacy here at ISU and a member of the Borg Center Advisory Board. Thanks for being here today. Today we're excited to have Dr. Grace King and Dr. Sonja Klein from the School of Teaching and Learning here with us today to share their expertise in a presentation titled Towards Transformative and Humanizing Critical Writing Pedagogy. And I, for one, am very excited. So we have an hour together today to engage with our experts and each other around the topic of critical writing pedagogy. During the presentation, we encourage you to use the Zoom chat feature to post comments and to interact with each other as much as you can. If you have specific questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A feature. And then I'll be back toward the end so we can facilitate a short Q&A with our featured speakers. And now we're ready to get started. So welcome, Dr. King and Dr. Klein. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. We know that you're all very busy and we understand that these are particularly challenging times. So we really appreciate you joining us for this hour today. Our goal is to collaborate with educators in ongoing and action-focused inquiry to center critical orientations to writing. We're not going to be able to achieve that goal today. This is just a one-off webinar. But what we do plan to do today is begin this conversation with you. And in particular, we're going to discuss 3 theoretical orientations to writing. We are going to highlight critical orientations to writing. We will introduce a tool to illuminate theories in practice. And we're going to provide some opportunities to reflect on and reimagine writing pedagogy. Now, in a moment, Grace and I are going to talk about our own journeys as writers and teachers of writing. But while we're doing that, we'd like you to think about your journey as a writer, as a teacher of writing, wherever you are in this journey. And I know we have people from teaching many different grade levels. We have pre-service teachers, we have in-service teachers, we have teacher educators. So wherever you are in that journey, think about it and perhaps share in the chat maybe a book or an experience or a person or an event, anything that's really influenced you. So my name is Dr. Sonja Klein. I think I get to go first because my timeline goes back the furthest. And as you can see, it's been quite a journey, both in terms of place, but also in terms of how I've really changed in how I've thought about writing over the years. So growing up in the 1970s and 80s in the southeast of England, the messages I was getting as a child was writing is about correctness. Writing is about neatness. It's something that's assigned to me. So those were some of the big messages that I got early on as a child. And it wasn't till much later when I was studying history in high school that I had a teacher that really got me excited about writing and made me think about writing as thinking and analyzing and exploring. And in particular, I remember writing an essay which was titled, "Will Germany Ever Be Reunited?" And I remember arguing that it would, and that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. So I remember that as a moment. Then later, when I went in my teacher education program and my early teacher education program, writing was not really mentioned very much. Reading was the thing. I did lots of work on reading, and writing was really limited. So when I first became a teacher, I was sort of drawing on my past experiences with writing, and I tended to assign writing rather than teach writing. And I use lots of creative writing, but as I said, I really didn't teach writing and I really didn't know how to. And it wasn't until much later that I had some influential experiences that really helped me to become a better teacher of writing. Some of those were working internationally in Budapest, and then in the United Nations School. I really started to understand the importance of multilingualism. And then also while working at the United Nations School, I was part of a professional learning group that read The Art of Teaching Writing. And then later, really involved with the Teachers College Writing Project. And that is when I started to have writing workshops in my classroom and conferencing and sharing writing. And I really felt like in many ways, I learned to write through teaching writing. A couple of other things that have really been influential in my journey. Wasn't until I came to America that I really became aware of my English accent and the difference between American English and British English. And I do remember having an awful occasion where I'd written 30 pages of reports for students and the principal sent them back to me because there's comma differences and spelling differences, and I got myself into quite a lot of trouble then. But usually it's kind of, I have fun with some of those differences. Another thing that's been really influential to me is my daughter, Emma. She has cerebral palsy, she has a speech and language impairment, and writing is really hard for her. But when I see her, I know that the social purpose of writing becomes really important. When her camp counselors wrote letters to her, notes to her, she wanted to write back to every single one of them every single night. So that social purpose of writing was really highlighted through Emma. I'm going to pass it over to Grace for a moment, and then we'll come back together.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Dr. Grace King, and I'm going to share a little bit about my journey. And as you look at the slide, you'll see that it may look a little different and a bit more experiential versus maybe I also didn't want to reveal my age, but on here, you'll take a look that in my childhood that there was I highlight that I am a child of immigrants and I am Korean American. And you can see that with the meshing of the American and the Korean flag. And the other image that may look a little interesting is the chopsticks, and then there's a fork at the end. And I chose that image to highlight that my parents really encouraged me to assimilate, and they didn't put that word to label assimilation of what was happening, but they really encouraged that I would be immersed in American culture, learning English, and really they didn't emphasize learning Korean and Korean culture because they really hoped that I would become American and highlight the learning of English and becoming very fluent. And so that was definitely a key part of my childhood. And in school, I read a lot of books and I wrote a lot. The literacy was my favorite subjects, reading and writing. And you can see there that I really enjoyed book authors like Judy Blume, and also, I enjoyed the Ramona series. And so there was this mismatch in the books that I read and the stories that I wrote between who I was and my cultural background and the things that I often learned in school. As I continued on to middle school and high school, I really enjoyed school because I had a whole host of diverse experiences. And I had a lot of diverse groups of friends. And so you could see that iconic image of the Friends sitcom, but I would actually say my friends look like the friends on the bottom. So I had friends from all over the world. They were from Germany and Poland and India and China and just all over. And I had African-American friends and white friends and, Asian friends, all of it. And I just really enjoyed learning from each other and just really through hanging out. It wasn't that we were per se learning from each other, but as we hung out, we got to understand our various cultures and our various backgrounds. And that really spoke a lot to me, volumes to me. And in high school, the first book I ever read with Asian characters was the Joy Luck Club. And that experience created a shift for me in being able to see characters that look like me. And then when that became a movie, I went and saw the movie, and just the same, that it was a very unique experience because I had never experienced that before. And so those experiences all stayed with me as I went to college and graduate school. And in college, there was this, the book, The Souls of Black Folk really stood out to me, and it made me have this understanding of what double consciousness is, and to understand my cultural world and my understanding of the way that I perhaps was raised, and the language that I would, inner conversation that I would have in my mind, with also pairing that with what's going on in larger society and from the larger dominant perspective of society. And so I had started to go on this journey of understanding society a little bit more. And I had gone to a university that had a mascot that was very much dehumanizing. And I still, in my undergraduate experience, I didn't think much of it. And then in grad school, I came to unpack that a little bit more, but still not fully grasping what it really meant. And so that was a little bit of me starting in that journey of understanding larger society and dominant perspectives. And then when I started teaching K-6, I really immersed myself in this idea of writer's workshop. And so I had read a lot about Lucy Calkins and used units of study, and Nancy Atwell's In the Middle, and Ralph Fletcher's craft lessons. Those really became gurus that I turned to, and they really trained me in this idea of writer's workshop and writing conferences. And I really grew in this understanding and mutual respect for my students, where the writing process was really highlighted. I wanted to hear the stories that they were writing and really connect our time together in the teaching of writing. And so that's a little bit of where I am up to my teaching experience. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about how Dr. Klein and my story kind of meet and where we come together. And so we both went to the University of Illinois for graduate school to get our PhDs. And we had the same advisor, and we learned a lot from her. Her name is Dr. Sarah McCarthy, and we took courses from some very similar professors. One professor that we're going to talk a little bit about as we go throughout this session is Dr. Ann Hess-Dyson. And in courses like hers, where we unpack deep ideas of systemic issues and norms, and we really came to understand systemic racism and how we viewed the world completely differently. And to understand these issues, we came to see ideas of critical orientations and humanizing approaches to teaching writing, and also culturally sustaining pedagogies. And so today we're going to talk quite a bit about that. But again, how our journeys have come together is this idea of humanizing and transformative writing pedagogies, and where we see that our identities, our personal identities and our professional identities have really come together. And we see that that's not only in the classroom, but even outside the classroom. So I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Klein to continue this slide.
Yeah, and also while we were at the University of Illinois, at different times, we both engaged in the National Writing Project Institute, which was incredibly meaningful to both of us. And I think it also highlights the idea of teachers teaching teachers and teachers as agents of reform. And one of the things that we really want to focus on tonight is this kind of work, this kind of critical work, is work that needs to be led by teachers in the classroom, that they are the agents of change. Another thing that was really important to me during my time at the University of Illinois was being a member of a writing group and actually getting to understand academic writing and the messiness of writing in general by working really closely in that social group. And then also, I became much more critically aware of language critically. It really helped me to put my language differences in context and made me aware of the privilege that I hold as an English speaker and a British English speaker, and the ways that other languages and dialects are often treated in deficit ways and the problematic nature of that. While at the University of Illinois, I also got a deep understanding of different theories of writing. And I wish that I had got that a lot earlier. And I know Grace and I both talk about theories with our undergrads in our graduate classes, because this is so important. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that now. But first, Grace.
Okay, so if you take a look at this slide, you'll see this idea of a critical orientation. And so what do we mean by critical orientations and why do they matter? So this is an image here of Dr. Goldie Muhammad, and she has really opened our eyes and perspectives of how to unpack this idea of critical. And so she talks about the little c critical and then the big C critical. And we find that to be very useful. The lowercase critical refers to deep thinking, whereas the uppercase critical includes the uppercase critical really interrogates dominant society by working towards dismantling power, oppression, and racism. So we understand that the absence of critical pedagogy is really problematic for all of us, our students. It's particularly damaging for students who are racially, linguistically, and culturally different from white middle class norms and white mainstream English that's often privileged in our schools.
So before we talk about theories, we want to make a distinction between approaches to writing pedagogy and theoretical orientations of writing. And approaches might involve something like doing a workshop approach, a process approach, using conferences, using mini lessons or focus lessons, sharing writing. These are all kinds of different approaches to writing pedagogy. And teachers may utilize a particular pedagogical approach, but given their theoretical orientation, their teaching and their students' experiences of writing are going to differ drastically. So depending on the theories that we draw on, we may sort of shut down or narrow students' experiences, or we may broaden them. We may help them to develop, possess agency, and to develop as their identities as writers and as humans. So we believe it's essential to raise our theoretical awareness. And we often take up theories implicitly from our past experiences, from writing curriculum that's available to us. And theoretical awareness helps us to see what we privilege and what we neglect. And it makes us, really conscious of making those pedagogical decisions. So we're going to overview three theories. I want you to be aware that these theories, we're going to present them as distinct theories, but they overlap, they're dynamic, and you'll see them in classrooms in complementary ways and in contradictory ways. So as we discuss each of these theoretical orientations, begin to consider the theoretical orientations of writing that predominate in your past school experiences and in your current school setting. So the first theory we're going to talk about is cognitive theory. And from a cognitive orientation, writing centers on the processes occurring inside an individual's mind. And this view is grounded in cognitive psychology, and it builds on models of writing created from examining the mental processes of experienced writers. And this is the Flower and Hayes model that you will see here. So it really sort of draws our attention to things like how students are having to use long-term memory, how they're using working memory to do things like generate ideas, to translate through handwriting and typing, and how they have to read their work and edit their work and manage the task environment. So from this perspective, writing is recognized as a complex problem-solving activity requiring the coordination of multiple processes. And it's really important to understand this perspective because I think it really highlights how complicated, how many different things an individual writer needs to navigate as they go through writing. From this perspective, a teacher's central role is to illuminate and provide scaffolds to sort of reduce the cognitive load of students, things like graphic organizers and help managing the tasks.
So I'm going to share a little bit about the sociocultural orientation, and a sociocultural orientation sees social and cultural identities as key central pieces. So a sociocultural orientation views writing as a technology that exists for social purposes. A writing scholar, Charles Dazerman, he notes that it is a learned and produced in social circumstances, establishes social relationships, changes the writer's social presence, creates shared meaning, and accomplishes social action. So writers write to participate in social worlds that make rhetorical decisions based on social context. You can see here that writers are enculturated by literacy sponsors. So as we look at that image here on the top right, any agent, perhaps a teacher, a celebrity, and an organization who supports and or suppresses literacy for an individual. So importantly, scholars exist within homes, communities, and societies, not just in schools. So sometimes a mismatch, like I described earlier, between the literacy culture of a child's home and community and that of the school can likely negatively impact a child's educational experience and performance. So teaching from a sociocultural orientation involves attending to students' social and cultural identities. So as you can see over here in the text on the left, like we talked about earlier, Dr. Ann Huss-Dyson, we shared how her role earlier in our past histories, really, she was a literacy sponsor for the both of us. And she reveals to us that teachers that come from a sociocultural orientation draw on students' social worlds. So positioning students as decision makers and social actors. And then over here on the bottom right, we can see that we highlight play and talk in all kinds of writing and composing.
So I'm going to talk about critical pedagogies, a critical orientation to writing. But I think it's important to note that critical and social cultural theories intersect, and both consider the ways that literacies are historically, culturally, and politically situated. Fundamental to critical orientations, however, is a focus on power and privilege and a commitment to challenge oppressive structures and to engage in equity work. Critical pedagogy is grounded in the work of Freire, who advocated for a problem-posing approach that centers learners' lived experiences, raises learners' awareness of systems of oppression, and engages learners in transformative action. And as such, critical orientations are intimately connected to practice. They call for humanizing pedagogy that embeds instruction within the larger project of dismantling inequitable structures. So, as we mentioned, Freire is really at the center of seen as one of the fathers of critical pedagogy. But sometimes his work's critiqued for focusing more on class, social class, than on race. And when we think of critical orientations, we also draw on many of these other scholars that you can see on this screen that really help us to foreground race in this work as well. So, to To assist educators in raising theoretical awareness, we designed a tool to illuminate theories in practice and to investigate writing pedagogy. And you'll see from left to right, the tool showcases our 3 theories that we've just talked about. And then from top to bottom, the tool highlights these theories across 4 dimensions of writing. And we could use other dimensions, but we found these ones really useful in helping educators. We're not expecting you to be able to see the tool right now, but we're going to put that in the chat for you so you can look at it more closely. And as we said, we're going to talk, what we're going to do now is talk about each one of these dimensions of writing, talk about it from a more traditional perspective, and then we will talk about it, what it looks like more critically. But first, we'd like you to take a close look at the tool.
All right, so I put the tool inside the chat for all of us. It's a Google Doc, and so together we'd like to reflect and think through some of the aspects, the dimensions on this tool. And so I'm going to show an example. If I were to comment on the tool, I think if you go to the tool, you'll see my commenting on there. So I'm going to use the Google commenting tool, which is the little plus arrow, or it's not an arrow, it's a little cross, a little plus sign. And when you click on that, you can highlight a part of the tool, and this will work in real time. So if you also can highlight a part of this, that would be great. And so as you view the tool, choose a dimension. And then as you read a part that reflects your teaching, or perhaps even your past schooling writing practices or schooling experiences, highlight and comment on how perhaps that related to you and perhaps relates to your teaching, or perhaps relates to your school's perspective on teaching writing. And so I'm going to go ahead and go to the tool, and I may perhaps go ahead and highlight students are taught about a narrow range of text types in the cognitive column under genre. And these text types are typically reduced to a series of text features. So perhaps I would go ahead and type on there using the Google commenting tool that my previous school district had teachers focus on several genres, and that was mainly narrative, persuasive, and expository. And so perhaps that's the way that I would say in my past experiences or current experiences that I could see this tool or see this column and dimension relating to me in my past writing experiences or present as well. So we'd like you to go ahead and take a minute or two to pick one area and how that perhaps relates to you or your past experiences as a student or as a teacher, so that we can, because we're going to continue to unpack this tool together.
So first, we're going to talk about genre, and you can continue to work in the tool as we're talking. But typically in your school or experience, how is the concept of genre addressed in writing instruction? And in my experience, genre is often treated in simplistic and misleading ways in school. Educational materials sometimes equate genres with structural forms of writing, like essay, story. Sometimes we see genres presented as rhetorical modes of discourse, like inform, persuade. And in addition, I think more recently, the text types from the Common Core standards are commonly used synonymously with genre. And a problem with this is these ways really fail to emphasize a central point about genres. And that is, genres are typical ways of accomplishing social actions. So let's take a look at what genre might look like from a more critical perspective. And a really important starting point is to use an inquiry approach to genre, to actually get students, rather than telling them the features of a particular text, to actually get them to identify and explore different texts. And as well as traditional texts that we see in school, they might explore other texts like candy wrappers or t-shirts, infographics, cereal boxes, all kinds of things. But through this inquiry, certain understandings are likely to arise about genre. And that is that genres are everywhere, that they're ways that humans accomplish particular social purposes, that genres are much more fluid and hybrid than is often assumed. Conventions are regularly broken, genres are often combined, and one text might both inform and persuade, and stories are ubiquitous across all kinds of different genres. And really getting students to think about who created a text and what was the purpose of them creating that text as part of this approach to genre. And then the other thing you might do in terms of teaching writing for standardized assessment is actually teach that as a separate genre and engage in critical discussions of genres of writing. So students do not equate these forms of writing with all writing. So the inquiry approach is a starting point, but then it's really important then to guide students to address issues of power and equity. And we think that, you know, if you actually engage them in inquiry, they often come up with these issues themselves. So you might sort of be looking at t-shirts, and they might start to notice where t-shirts have come from, like many are produced, and start conversations about sweatshops, about child labor. You might look at cereal boxes and talk about the ways that they try to present themselves as healthy when they contain lots of sugar and artificial ingredients and all those kinds of things. And then also looking at a lot of different mentor texts that speak to action, to social action, and protest, and help inspire students to be activists, whether they're poems or memes. I love this book, Rise Up. There's some great, it tells you about a lot of great protest posters. And then you can also really get students to consider local issues that matters to them, national issues that matter to them, global issues, and then think about writing for advocacy and social justice.
So if we take a look at this slide, we are going to think about the dimension of grammar and language. And so a few questions that we have for you to consider is, how do you teach and assess grammar and language? Are your students' grammar and language practices aligned with those of your school's grammar and language practices? And anytime you see that little chat icon, if you'd like to, you can go ahead and respond to that using the chat feature. Or also, we'd like you to just critically think about these questions as well. So the next slide, oh, I'm sorry. I also wanted to just mention that traditionally, when we think about grammar and language, that it's housed in binaries, where white mainstream English is acceptable and mandated in academic spaces. And then various dialects and languages are often discouraged and unwelcomed in classrooms. And a lot of that work around white mainstream English and Black language is done by this picture you can see here by Dr. April Baker Bell. And she really helps us to think about how languages are often housed in binaries and the ways that they're acceptable or mandated in school spaces. And this is something that we really want to discourage, that we would hope to see languages more as fluid and opportunities for students to be able to disrupt this binary, that we invite students to draw on their diverse linguistic and cultural competencies, and we also welcome and value their linguistic dexterity. So on the next slide, we wanted to share some critical examples and ways that we can see this in action regarding grammar and language. So the first example we'd like to share is considering code meshing. And so code meshing is a pedagogical application. We critique past suggestions of code switching practices that often are problematic because it proposes that white mainstream English is for academic context, while it's acceptable to switch to various dialects and languages in other contexts like the playground. But we really see that code meshing gives students an opportunity to combine multiple languages and dialects in any communication context. So really enabling students to exert agency within their language on a level playing field. So we would really encourage code meshing in the classroom, out of the classroom, really giving students that flexibility and fluidity with language. A second application we suggest is using critical language awareness. So we also explore the situated nature of language and grammar with students and support them to develop critical language awareness using ways that white mainstream English holds power and provides privilege for dominant groups in society. So really helping students to unpack that and to understand that. For example, when students are engaging in pre-writing activities, peer discussions, or generating ideas in their writer's notebooks, the content and language of their conversations and writing should reflect all their experiences, cultures, and communicative resources. So in fact, at every stage of the writing process, this should be the case. So this should be true for all students, including English language learners, Black language speakers, and seeing that Black language is a registered language. And it's been a registered language for a very long time, but still many educators regard it in deficit ways. We really see this as something that needs to stop. And we believe that valuing Black language is empowering students to fluidly use and apply Black language in and out of the classroom. So really encouraging students to draw on their linguistic repertoires and code meshing in all contexts. The third example we wanted to share is using built-in scaffolds. So having discussions with students about power and privilege that white mainstream English holds. I shared a little bit about that in the critical language awareness section. But really, as we have those discussions, sharing that white mainstream English has become so normalized that many people are unaware of the power and the privilege that it affords. And so having built-in scaffolds, teachers can utilize to value and honor students' home languages, first languages, while building and growing students' competency in white mainstream English. Sometimes you hear the rebuttal, well, if I let students speak in Black language, then they're not going to learn white mainstream English. And I think this is something that we don't agree with, because we see that if we fluidly allow, and not even allow, but just have students be able to speak in their first language or in Black language or in their first language, then we're building students' competencies in that language, but also in white mainstream English. And so some scaffolds here you can see in that are pictured is perhaps to have something like a bidialectal dictionary in Black language and in white mainstream English, or maybe perhaps in Spanish and in English. Another example you could see here is having a T-chart. Maybe it's an ongoing T-chart that's like an anchor chart in your classroom, with Black languages perhaps on one side and white mainstream English is on another, so that they would be able to name these languages and you could have these discussions in class. Another example is to role play in both languages and to be able to do that with your students. And these examples and scaffolds really position students as knowers, just as teachers are knowers, and it's an equal level playing field. And we can learn from each other. Oh, and I'm going to go ahead and continue with agency and participation. So the questions here that we'd like you to think about are you required to adhere to a standardized literacy or writing curriculum? And how is student agency and participation addressed in your school or classroom? So the concepts of agency and participation are central to how educators and students experience teaching and learning. So when burdened with scripted or standardized curriculum, teachers become likely to tightly control students' experiences and limit their opportunities for agency and participation. So this can be somewhat dehumanizing, and this dehumanizing pedagogy can perpetuate the status quo of the dominant culture while devaluing students' and teachers' experiences and identities. So for example, if we were to consider the IRE structure, which the I stands for initiate, R stands for respond, and E stands for explain, right? So evaluate, I'm sorry. So in that structure, we see that students typically regard their roles as articulating predetermined responses. So that's saying that when the students are saying what the teacher wants to hear. So similarly, in terms of writing, teachers often initiate the assignment and students respond in a formulaic ways as they attempt to gain a positive evaluation from the teacher. So that's a little background on agency and participation. If we look at the next slide, we wanted to provide some ways that we could reconsider and really coming from a critical orientation when thinking about agency and participation. So if you look at the first part, we see a push back on standardized curricula and assessments. So when educators are mandated to use this kind of prescribed curriculum or standardized assessments, be transparent with your students about it. Let them know, like, this is a curriculum that I do need to teach because this is something that is mandated by the school district, and so forth. So explain that to your students, be honest and be transparent. And as you work with that curriculum, learn to negotiate and appropriate and alter the curriculum to best fit the needs of your students and your population that you're working with. In the second box, you can see encourage critical conversations. So really asking questions such as who wrote this and what are the backgrounds and cultures and perspectives, perhaps of the authors, maybe flipping to the author page of your curriculum. And critical conversations like these can reveal to students that most English language arts curriculum often center white backgrounds, perspectives, and histories, and often oppress and marginalize those that are not white. So having those kind of conversations with your students is very powerful. Thirdly, to co-construct curricula and assessments alongside students. So inviting students to propose their own composing projects. We all know that when students are the ones that come with their own ideas and are able to enact those ideas, they're very much all the more passionate and more interested and invested in those topics. For really also encouraging them to come up with various forms of writing and the audiences that they want to share this writing with. So supporting students to select digital tools and organize collaborations and propose their own deadlines. So in addition, this enables students to make key decisions about assessment. And for instance, by negotiating the assessment product and evaluation criteria, and also, this helps students find authentic spaces to share their writing in and out of the classroom. So whether it's local newspapers or magazines or blogs or community forums or even national contests. So students are empowered to critique dominant culture, disrupt the commonplace, and take action. And so an example of this is youth-led participatory action research, which you can see the link right here is yparhub.berkeley.edu. And this is a really great example of how agency and participation might look from a critical perspective. And in YPAR, students are positioned as experts and really producers of knowledge, not just consumers, but really producers, and investigate issues that matter to them, and they can enact social change. So I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Klein to take a look at technology and digital media.
So a couple of questions to think about is, how does technology empower students and transform education? And how do you use technology and digital media in the writing classroom? And I'm going to say my view of the first question, and that is technology does not empower students. It does not transform any education. I think many technologies have the potential to do that, but it's how we use them that really matters. And unfortunately, way too often we see examples of technologies being used that really replicate and perpetuate very traditional approaches to writing. For instance, when students complete a worksheet on a tablet, or when they're observing the teacher writing on an electronic whiteboard. So I'm going to talk now about some ways that we think that critical pedagogy, that technology looks like in terms of a critical orientation. And I want to draw your attention to this book, Critical Digital Literacies. Several of the ideas that I'm talking about come from this text. It's a recent text, 2021, and our colleague Anna Smith wrote a chapter in the book and wrote the closing to this book. It's a really great book with lots of ideas. But in contrast, critical orientations really disrupt skills-based definitions of writing and narrow assumptions of what it means to be a writer. So in critically orientated classrooms, teachers and students, they acknowledge that the world is ever changing and it's increasingly digital. And in such a space, nobody can be an expert in everything. So teachers really have to acknowledge that they're novices, and sometimes the different students will emerge as experts with different technologies. So hopefully this starts to sort of disrupt some of the hierarchies that can occur in more traditional classroom spaces. Also, students are positioned as designers and creators. They create podcasts, memes, websites, blogs, and they connect to wider audiences. I've put in a few of my favorite tools that I'm using at the moment, Canva, lots of different things that you can collaboratively create, Padlet, Flipgrid, Adobe Spark, but please share in the chat if you have other digital tools that you use to help your students collaborate, to position them as designers and creators. And also as activists and advocates. You know, we've talked a little bit about this in terms of genre, but this is also true that digital media gives them more opportunities to connect. So they can use hashtags to dialogue with others and stand against systemic inequities while uplifting communities. Also positioning our students as both skeptics and critics, we can get them to create manipulated media so that they can doctor images and create manipulated images to see how easy it is to do that, and to sort of be able to critique images that have been manipulated. Another example, and I'll put this in the chat, is the Data Smart Kids project, which is actually a project for preteens, but there's some great resources on there for all educators that can really help students really critically think about how their attention is managed and their preferences shaped through using social media. So we think that's a really important thing for children to understand. Oh, 1 second. Okay, so obviously we've run through a lot of ideas very quickly today. And we wanted to just draw your attention to the fact that what we've talked about today is part of a big project. And we have an article coming out in Language Arts in May 2020 that talks about this broader framework. So we've really only done a little bit of the reflecting today, but our article, Reflect, Reimagine, Revisit, a framework for centering critical writing pedagogy, really talks about these things in more detail. And the cover you're seeing there of Language Arts is the most recent issue, and definitely one I would recommend. It's all about anti-racist pedagogy. So there's another great resource. And I know for one thing, you know, in part of my journey right now, like my next action step is to read this article, which is a framework for enacting anti-racist language instruction. So we want you to maybe think about your next steps.
Great. So yeah, I definitely agree with Dr. Klein. I am also, that's on my shelf right here to read as well. So that same link that we shared with you on the Google Doc, we'll go ahead and we'll put it in the chat again. And we would like to think about ways that we could reimagine as we look at this tool. So we're really glad that you joined us today. We know we threw quite a bit at you, but as we consider the 3R framework, we are in this reimagining stage. So as we go back to the tool, consider now on that critical column on the far right, how can you reimagine a specific dimension before you leave today? How could you reimagine in that dimension, a specific dimension in that critical column, and then using the commenting tool, if you could please write one actionable step. And again, it's that same Google Doc, and if you could go on there and just highlight maybe one section of one dimension of the critical column, or maybe one description within a dimension, we would really appreciate that. If you go ahead, as you can continue to do that, but on the next slide also, we know that we did throw quite a bit at you. And so we would love for you to, if you're interested, to learn more about this, or if maybe perhaps if this is something that you're very interested in, we knew we couldn't get through everything in this one-off workshop, but this is critical and important work. And if it's interesting to you, we would love to continue these conversations. So we have a Google form that is also that I will go ahead and link in the chat right now. And if you're interested, we would love for you to join us to continue some of these conversations. And it just asks for just some information about yourself and which school you're at, what grade level you teach, some very basic information. And perhaps we can connect and have some more critical conversations around writing.
So on this final slide, you'll just see our contact information. So please feel free to contact us, and as Grace said, to share in the Google form if you're interested. This work is work that needs to be done with educators in collaboration, working together. We are the ones that can advocate for our students, and we fully understand that these are challenging times. But we also think that is why critical writing pedagogy is so essential for our students. And we're just going to open it up. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. And we'll make sure that we finish on time. Maybe I'll stop sharing this.
Well, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm pretty fired up to be thinking about writing with my students now. So.
The Google form in the chat. Yes, let's do that.
I think I put it there, but it might have gotten lost. It's right underneath the second doc, Google Doc.
I've put it in again, so.
Okay. I mean, the tool that a lot of you wrote on is really interesting, the things that you've written, whether it's past experiences or current teaching, your current teaching situation, as well as some of your actionable steps are very, very interesting and really neat to see.
Well, we don't appear to have any questions. So I always think that educators are always grateful if something takes less time.
This is
Yeah, I've seen
true.
this meme, like in a world where you can be anything, be the person that ends the meeting early.
Yeah.
It's a great
Well,
quote.
I want, yeah, so accurate. Well, I want to say thank you on behalf of the Borg Center to Dr. King and Dr. Klein, and thank you for all of you that came and joined in with us today. We are interested in your feedback about this session, sort of in addition to or separately from the links that Grace and Sonja provided. So we would like to know your feedback for the session and then also ideas about topics for future webinars. So tomorrow you'll receive a follow-up email that includes a link to a short survey. And if you're interested in receiving a PD hour for your attendance today, there's also a link to the evidence of completion form at the end of the survey as well. So by early next week, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Redbird Educator Series site. So if you want to go back and revisit it, that will be available early next week. This is our final webinar for the fall semester, and we'll be back in the spring. So keep your eyes on that Redbird Educator Series website. So I'm sure we'll have lots of great stuff next semester as well. So thanks again for spending time with us today. Thank you, Dr. King and Dr. Klein. Take care, and we hope we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,